The martial arts of China and other nearby cultures in Asia are world famous. They have enriched the lives of millions of men and women, maybe including many of those watching this video right now. If you've practiced one of the ancient martial arts of China for a number of years, you may have had the experience of marveling at the astonishing depth of these amazing systems and asked yourself how anyone could have possibly come up with something so profound. They seem almost superhuman in their origin. According to some very ancient traditions, the martial arts originated with the movements introduced by a wandering sage who came to China long ago and whose travels brought him to the famous Shaolin Temple in the region of Song Mountain, and who noticed that the monks at the temple were in poor physical shape, so he gave them certain sequences of meditative movements that they could perform while continuing to progress with their meditation at the same time. Let's examine the story of the life of Bodhidharma, who is known in China by the name DaMo, derived from Bodhidharma, and who is credited with introducing Ch'an Buddhism to China, which became Zen Buddhism in Japan, where Bodhidharma is known as Daruma. The story of the life of DaMo is found in many early texts, including those listed here. Some of the details of the DaMo story are clearly mythical in nature, and yet many historians assume that he was also an actual historical figure. These texts say that DaMo came from Persia or from India, that he was one of 3 illustrious sons of a great king, and that he renounced worldly things to follow the Mahayana path, wandering the earth and eventually coming to China. The most well-known aspects of the DaMo story involve his encounter with a monk named Shen Guang, one who is described as being a monk of great learning, well read in many classic texts, one who could discourse eloquently upon the dark learning, and one who had heard that a great master had come to the Shaolin Temple on Mount Song and was sitting in deep meditation facing a wall without speaking to anyone for days on end. In some accounts, it's said that Shen Guang encountered DaMo while Shen Guang was lecturing to a large crowd, and he noticed DaMo listening at the edge of the crowd, a little ways apart, sometimes nodding in agreement, but also sometimes shaking his head in disapproval. This angered Shen Guang, who took his string of monk's beads and began to flick the beads at DaMo, even knocking out some of his teeth. But DaMo apparently didn't even notice, but only turned away, which made Shen Guang even more anxious to learn from DaMo, who was obviously such a great master that he could exhibit utmost serenity and detachment in any situation. However, when Shen Guang approached DaMo in hopes that the Dharma master would impart some of his wisdom, he always found the sage in deep meditation, ignoring Shen Guang's presence. The scroll of the transmission of the lamp tells us, Shen Guang went, visiting morning and evening for instruction. Master DaMo was always sitting in a dignified posture, facing a wall, and so Guang heard no teachings, nor did he receive any encouragement. On December 9th of that year, a great snow fell, yet Guang resolutely remained standing and didn't even move, so that at daybreak the snow was more than knee-high. The master, taking pity on Guang, said to him, "You have been standing in the snow for a long time. What is it that you seek?" Guang, in desperation, replied, "Only to wish that the venerable sir might exercise compassion by opening the portal to the sweet dew of the Dharma to liberate all beings?" The Master replied, "The supreme and wonderful way of all the Buddhas can be put into practice only with vast kalpas of energetic perseverance in the difficult training and the enduring of the unendurable. So how, with hardly any virtue and little knowledge, with a shallow mind and lazy heart, is it possible to wish to practice in the true vehicle? This would be diligent labor in vain." When Guang heard this lesson from the Master, he secretly took a sword, cut off his own left arm, and placed it in front of his Master. The Master realized then that Guang was a vessel of the Dharma and said, "All the Buddhas, on first aspiring to the way, forgot their body for the sake of the Dharma. You, having cut off your arm in front of me today, may also be of such a stamp." The Master then renamed Guang Hui Ke. These two words mean intelligence and ability. Hui Ke, or Wai Hak in Cantonese. Shen Guang is thus also known as Da Zu Hui Ke, which means great ancestor of intelligence and ability, or Dai Zo Wai Hak in Cantonese. These are some of the main elements of the DaMo story. We'll see a few others as we discuss the evidence that these characters and events are describing specific constellations, which also show up in other myths from around the world. In order to begin to identify the characters and events in these ancient stories, we can first begin to examine the most distinctive aspects of each of the players. For example, anyone who has read numerous versions of the DaMo story will readily agree that the most distinctive characteristic of DaMo himself is his practice of sitting in silent meditation for days or even for years on end. The most distinctive characteristic of Shen Guang, who later becomes Da Zu Hui Ke, is standing patiently behind Master DaMo, hoping that DaMo will notice him, and of course his act of cutting off his own left arm with a sword. Based on my examination of hundreds or even thousands of celestial myths from cultures around the world, I would immediately nominate the constellation of Boötes as a candidate constellation to examine whenever we encounter a myth involving a tranquil, detached, seated, or meditating figure. And the fact that DaMo is described as meditating for 9 years, and that meditating is one of his most distinctive aspects, argues that we should consider the possibility that DaMo corresponds to the figure of Boötes in the night sky. Here is the constellation of Boötes. It's a northern constellation, facing towards the handle of the Big Dipper, and thus fairly close to the North Celestial Pole, around which the entire northern sky appears to turn. The very axis of the Earth's rotation can be thought of as extending through this northern central point in the heavens. One of the very earliest mentions of DaMo in an ancient text says that he was most impressed by the golden discs on the central spire of a stupa in Yongning, China. And we can see that as a reference to the central axis of the sky, of which the central spire of a stupa is a symbolic sacred model. Immediately behind the constellation Boötes is the powerful figure of the constellation Hercules, brandishing a massive club, which can also be envisioned as a sword, over its head. Remember that Shen Guang stands behind the meditating figure of DaMo, trying to gain his attention. In one episode from the story of DaMo and Shen Guang takes his monk's beads and starts to flick them at DaMo's head. Notice that near the constellation Hercules is a beautiful arc of stars, which form a constellation known as the Northern Crown, or Corona Borealis, which plays the role of a necklace or string of jewels in many myths, and which almost certainly plays the role of Shen Guang's string of beads in the DaMo story. Note that after Shen Guang flicks some beads at DaMo's head, even knocking out a few teeth, DaMo simply turns away, which is what we see in the constellations themselves. DaMo, played by Boötes, has turned his back to Shen Guang, played by Hercules. We could even speculate that this pipe coming out of the mouth of Boötes represents or was envisioned as a tooth flying out of his mouth, but it's hard to be certain about that. In any case, the presence of Corona Borealis, the Northern Crown, right next to the constellation Hercules is a strong clue that we're on the right track in our identification of these two legendary figures. Now, when Shen Guang tries to visit Master DaMo, he always finds DaMo deep in meditation, refusing to say a word to him. But one night, the snow falls so heavily that it comes up to Shen Guang's knees by the morning, and DaMo is finally moved with pity at the sight of Shen Guang standing in the snow, and he speaks to Shen Guang for the first time. Notice the band of the Milky Way galaxy, which partially covers the legs of the constellation Hercules. This may be the inspiration for this part of the DaMo Shen Guang story. Another possibility, though, is that Shen Guang in this part of the story is associated with the constellation Ophiuchus. Ophiuchus has even more of its legs immersed in the Milky Way band. Ophiuchus is right below Hercules in the night sky. So Ophiuchus has even more of its legs covered by the Milky Way band, which could give rise to that episode in which Shen Guang stands all night in the snowstorm until the snow reaches up to his knees. The Milky Way, I'm suggesting, is the snow, that's the snowdrift rising up over the legs of either Ophiuchus or Hercules, and thus Shen Guang. Additionally, as we've seen in many traditional depictions of DaMo and Shen Guang, many of the artists' portrayals through the centuries, Shen Guang is often shown as being a little bit below the level of DaMo, which would be consistent with the positioning of Ophiuchus in relation to Boötes in the night sky. For viewers in the Northern Hemisphere, Ophiuchus is a little lower than Boötes. Ophiuchus is lower than Hercules. In any case, when Shen Guang does take his sword and then severs his own left arm in order to prove his devotion to DaMo, Shen Guang at that point is clearly associated with the constellation Hercules. Hercules, the outline of Hercules is holding a great weapon over its head with the right hand of the constellation. So that could easily be envisioned as the sword that he's holding up, and then you can see he could easily be envisioned as cutting off his own left hand, Hercules. Note how his left hand is hanging downwards in the outline in the sky. Additionally, the texts themselves tell us that Shen Guang places his severed arm in front of DaMo, and in the sky we see a constellation in front of Boötes, which probably plays the role of Shen Guang's severed arm, and that is the constellation known as Coma Berenices, which you see outlined here. This constellation plays the role of Shen Guang's severed arm in this part of the story. And it's especially fascinating to see that in some of the traditional depictions of Shen Guang presenting his arm to DaMo, the artist has portrayed Shen Guang in a posture which is suggestive of the outline of the constellation Hercules in the night sky. For example, in this painting from Japan, The figure of Shen Guang is depicted down on his knees, with one foot behind him in a posture reminiscent of the constellation Hercules. Hercules in the sky appears to be on a knee, lunging or bending forward with his upper body. The most direct correspondence I've seen in an outline between an artistic depiction and the outline of the constellation Hercules comes from a painting in a temple to Bodhidharma in Korea, which is shown on the website of Dale Corrington. And this website is known as Dale's Korean Temple Adventures. It's a website that's well worth exploring. Look at the outline of Shen Guang in this painting from the Boyunsa Temple in Goseong in the southeast corner of the Korean peninsula. Shen Guang has just cut off his arm and is presenting it to Bodhidharma. Can you see how the artist has portrayed Shen Guang, later renamed Dazu Hui Kei, with an outline that corresponds very closely to the outline of the constellation Hercules in the night sky? I believe that there are more than enough corroborating details in the various accounts of the DaMo story to positively identify DaMo with the constellation Boötes and Shen Guang with the constellation Hercules. There's another episode in the DaMo story which also helps to confirm this interpretation. That's the story in which DaMo must cross a body of water, often a river, but sometimes an ocean, on a broken reed or a leaf. You can see that here in this little figurine of DaMo. If you imagine him coming towards you, you can see the reed. It's almost like his surfboard. He's surfing towards us in this statuette here on this reed. In many aspects of the story, the reed is given to DaMo by an old woman at the edge of the river or ocean that DaMo must cross. And I would argue that the reed in this particular episode is also played by the constellation Coma Berenices again. That constellation is just ahead of Boötes, and it looks like a broken reed. There's actually some Bible verses that talk about a broken reed or a smoldering wick or a smoldering flax. Both of those are probably referring to the same constellation, Coma Berenices. It's just ahead of Boötes, probably inspires the story of DaMo crossing the river on that reed, or the ocean on that reed. The woman who gives this reed to DaMo is, of course, the constellation Virgo, located just below Coma Berenices and holding out her arm as if offering Coma Berenices to Boötes, just as the old woman in the story offers the reed to DaMo to help him across the river. Intriguingly, in some versions of this story, DaMo is able to cross the body of water on the reed, but when Shen Guang tries to do the same, he sinks into the stream. Once again, we see that if Shen Guang is played by the constellation Hercules, that constellation can be seen to be sinking down into the Milky Way. You see the Milky Way covering over his feet. That's the water, the river. While Boötes is not. He's already crossed over. If Shen Guang is associated with Ophiuchus, he's sinking down even further into the stream of the Milky Way. Notice, of course, that the pattern of a master who's able to walk above the water without sinking, while the devoted disciple cannot duplicate that and sinks down into the water, is a pattern that we see in the New Testament stories of Jesus walking on the water and Peter trying to do the same but sinking down. In some depictions of this well-known gospel episode, Peter, in fact, is depicted with an outline very suggestive of the constellation Hercules. Now, that doesn't mean that one or the other of these two stories borrowed from the other one. It doesn't mean, for instance, that DaMo crossing the river on a reed comes from the New Testament stories of Jesus walking on the water, or vice versa. There's abundant evidence that this system of celestial metaphor is older than ancient Egypt, older than Mesopotamia, older than ancient India, older than ancient China, older in fact older than any civilization known to conventional history. I believe it's most likely that these story patterns come from some extremely ancient ancestor culture, one which may have been destroyed by some catastrophe, and that the system of that now forgotten predecessor culture survives in different forms in the ancient myths and sacred stories of virtually every culture on our planet, no matter how widely separated geographically or even across the centuries. They're all based on the stars, and they're all using a common system which manifests itself in the sacred stories of different cultures on different continents. There are many other myths around the world where patterns related to the DaMo story can be found. For example, in the texts of ancient India, the story of Buddha meditating for days or weeks on end contains strong parallels to the DaMo stories, and these connections to the same figures of Boötes and Hercules can be confirmed by the fact that in some versions of the Buddha story, a figure named Vajrapani is described as standing behind or guarding the seated figure of the Buddha. And you can see that in this remarkable carving, which dates all the way back to the 2nd century AD, where we have the Buddha, and then behind him, the figure of Vajrapani. And note that Vajrapani has unmistakable characteristics related to the constellation Hercules, including an upraised arm bearing a powerful weapon, just like the constellation. The relationship between the Buddha and the figure of Vajrapani behind him in this ancient sculpture undoubtedly reflects the relative positions of constellations Hercules and Boötes in the night sky. And so this is additional confirmation that our interpretation of the story of DaMo and Shen Guang, or Dazu Huike, behind him as reflective of Boötes and Hercules is a correct interpretation. My study of the connection between the ancient myths and the heavenly cycle suggests that this ancient system, wherever it originated, uses the infinite realm of the heavens as a way of conveying truths about our connection to an infinite realm which we cannot see, but which is in fact very real. The realm of spirit, the unseen realm, the realm of the gods. The fact that DaMo, who is traditionally said to have brought Ch'an Buddhism to China and to have originated the martial arts, is clearly a figure who is situated in the heavenly realms. And that fact suggests that the practices of deep meditation associated with Bodhidharma and the practice of the profound martial arts of China and surrounding cultures are practices which were given to us by those in contact with this other realm, and that these disciplines in fact come from that other realm, the realm of the spirits or gods. It also suggests that these disciplines, especially prolonged silent meditation, as well as the moving meditation of the martial arts, are disciplines by which we can make contact with that invisible realm, the realm in which DaMo and Shen Guang move and operate. The ancient wisdom given to humanity in the form of the ancient myths and sacred stories, as well as in the form of disciplines such as meditation and Zen Buddhism and martial arts, should be seen as an amazing treasure, a precious inheritance from the deepest past. The better that we understand the worldwide system of celestial metaphor employed by our ancient predecessors, the better we will be able to hear their wisdom. which is given to us for our benefit and blessing. And the better we'll be able to apply it to our own lives.